The year was 1885, and in the tucked-away pocket of Montana known only as Widow's Hollow, the wind was as sharp as the stares of townsfolk and nearly as cold. Folks here didn't take kindly to what didn't fit, and Maribel Quinn had never fit. She was 32, unmarried, too soft in the waist, they said, too quiet in the mouth, the kind of woman folks passed by without really seeing unless they needed someone to scrub a floor or bake a pie for the town social. And yet, on the first day of spring, she arrived in her Sunday best at the Cedar Grove Chapel with hope folded neatly in her suitcase and a marriage contract in her pocket. The man she was to marry, Edwin Blackstone, was a widowed rancher with 2 children and failing crops. He hadn't written the letters himself, his sister had. But the money Maribel brought from back east was real, and that's what mattered to him. Or so he said. The ceremony was to be small, as Edwin had insisted. No need for fuss, he grunted when they met for the first time the day before. This ain't about love, it's about keeping the ranch alive. Maribel didn't argue. She never had much practice in it. But when she walked into the chapel the next day, hair-pinned eyes, hopeful heart trembling beneath her corset, she was met not with a greeting but with a silence that stung. Edwin stood at the altar, eyes narrowed. He turned to his sister and hissed. She didn't say she was that size. Laughter bubbled up in the pews, quiet but sharp. Maribel froze. I won't do it, Edwin said loudly, backing away like she'd drawn a pistol. I won't marry a woman who looks like that. I've got land to save, not ruin. The preacher cleared his throat awkwardly. Edwin walked out. Just like that. Maribel stood alone, the veil still clutched in her hand. A murmur rolled through the chapel like thunder rolling over dry earth. She didn't cry. She turned, chin lifted, and walked out with dignity that didn't ask permission. Past the gawking neighbours, past the pitying children, past the man who never knew her name. That evening she sat on the back step of the boarding house holding the veil in her lap. The sun dipped low behind the hills, and the sky burned like it was ashamed of what it had seen. In her lap the lace trembled, but Maribel did not. She simply whispered, God, if there's a place for women like me, I'll wait for it. And far across the hollow, a man in a soot-stained shirt watched the chapel lights go out his own heart, heavy with a grief the town had stopped asking about. They hadn't met yet, but they would. Have you ever been made to feel like you take up too much space when all you ever wanted was to belong somewhere? What happens when 2 people both cast aside, cross paths, not out of romance but out of quiet, necessary grace? When Maribel Quinn woke the next morning, the world was still whispering about her. She could hear it behind the clink of breakfast spoons at the boarding house. See it in the way the general store clerk avoided her eyes. Even the children, usually so carefree, stared like she was a ghost who hadn't gotten the message that she didn't belong. But Widow's Hollow had forgotten one thing about Maribel. She had spent her whole life learning how to survive being overlooked. She packed her valise, slowly folding her few dresses with care, and tucked the unused veil between the pages of her mother's prayer book. She didn't know where she was going, just that she couldn't stay where she wasn't wanted. The plan was to walk out of town, find a rail line, maybe write her cousin in Denver. But fate, as it often does in stories worth telling, had a different idea. At the edge of town, as she passed the old smithy that hadn't burned coal in 3 years, a deep voice called out, "You headed somewhere, Miss Quinn." She turned. The voice belonged to a man standing in the doorway of the carpenter's barn. Tall, broad-shouldered, shirt smudged with soot and sawdust. He wasn't handsome in a dime, novel way. Too tired, too real, but his face held something rare, a stillness. "I don't suppose it's any of your concern," she said quietly. He nodded once, respectfully. "No, ma'am, it ain't. Just not every day I see someone walking out of town with their whole life in one hand." There was no laughter in his tone, no judgment, just observation. She stood there for a moment. Then, as if something in her uncoiled, she said, "I had a wedding planned yesterday." I heard. Of course he had. He walked toward her boots, crunching dry gravel. "Name's Elijah Cutter. I do woodwork, coffins mostly, sometimes furniture." She blinked. That's an unusual pairing. He almost smiled. Life and death don't come that far apart in these parts. She didn't smile, But she didn't walk away either. "I don't mean to pry," Elijah added, "but I've got an empty bunkhouse and a back garden I can't keep up with since my leg went bad." She looked at the slight hitch in his walk. "Not charity," he clarified. "Just trade. You get a roof and warm food. I get less weeds and maybe a pie if you know how." Maribel tilted her head. "You're offering me work. I'm offering you a place where nobody laughs behind your back." That night, Maribel Quinn didn't leave Widow's Hollow. She unpacked in a small room behind Elijah's workshop, where the window overlooked a half-dead apple tree and a crooked fence that leaned like it had grown tired of pretending to be straight. She didn't trust him yet, but when she laid her head on the pillow, coarse but clean, she realized something startling. She hadn't felt afraid once all day. What happens when two people, each marked by rejection, begin to build something not from romance but from mutual need and unspoken kindness? Is it possible that love doesn't bloom loud but grows quiet, like wildflowers on the edge of a road? The rhythm of Elijah Cutter's homestead was unlike anything Maribel had ever known. It wasn't soft, but it was steady. The mornings began before the light had fully crept over the ridge, with the clatter of wood being split and the muted groan of hinges on the workshop door. Elijah never knocked. He didn't have to. By the third day, he simply set a tin mug of coffee on the porch rail and let her meet the dawn if she chose. She did. Each morning she tied back her hair, pulled on gloves a size too large, and weeded the garden row by row. The soil was stubborn, but she liked the honesty of it, how it didn't pretend to be more than it was. Elijah, for his part, kept his distance, but not coldly. He would pass her tools when her hands were full or silently refill the water pail without being asked. He never stared, but he always noticed. Like the morning, her hand trembled as she reached for the kettle, and he quietly pushed the stool closer, not saying a word. By the end of the first week, the garden looked like it belonged to someone. And so did the porch. And maybe, just a little so, did Maribel. One afternoon, a wagon rolled into the yard. Two townsmen she recognized, Mr. Hartley from the bank and the pastor from Sunday chapel. Their faces wore the same expressions she remembered from the wedding, tight, polite, patronizing. Elijah met them by the fence, arms crossed. "We came to check on Miss Quinn," the pastor said. "Given the circumstances." "She's fine," Elijah said. His tone wasn't sharp, but it closed the space between them like a door. Mr. Hartley cleared his throat. "There's talk, Elijah, about appearances, a man and a woman under the same roof. You came all the way out here to say that." Hartley shifted uncomfortably. "I build coffins, remember?" Elijah added, his voice quiet as dust. "I measure by inches, not gossip. She's safe. You can ride back now." Maribel watched from the window. When the wagon rolled away, she stepped outside. "You didn't have to do that," she said. He shrugged. "You didn't ask to be put under a microscope." "I did ask to borrow your world," she said. "You didn't borrow anything," he replied. "You're earning your place every day." She looked at him a moment longer, then quietly asked, "Why are you so kind to me?" He hesitated, not out of shame but care, as if he'd been holding back a truth too fragile to name. "Because no one was kind to my sister," he said at last. Maribel blinked. "You had a sister," had Elijah said. "She was a lot like you, smarter than the room, too strong for some folks to stomach." "What happened?" "She came home one winter with a baby and no husband. They talked, whispered, shut her out. She got sick and nobody helped." Maribel swallowed. "I'm sorry." "She didn't need sorry," he said, eyes distant. "She needed a neighbour." The silence between them wasn't heavy. It was sacred. And Maribel realized something as she stood there in the afternoon light. This man didn't owe her anything. And yet he was giving her something no one had in a very long time. Not protection, not pity, but place. That night she wrote in her journal, "I think I've been waiting for someone to meet me where I was without asking me to be less. Maybe I wasn't too much. Maybe they just didn't have room. What happens when kindness becomes care, and care begins to look like something deeper? Can two people who've only known survival begin to trust in something as fragile as affection?" It was the night of the first hard rain. The sky cracked open just past midnight, and the wind rolled through the valley like it had a score to settle. Elijah was already in the barn when it started securing tools and checking the roof for leaks. Maribel stood at the door of the workshop, shawl clutched around her shoulders, watching his outline move in and out of the lantern's flicker. He didn't call her back inside, and she didn't ask to go help. But after a few minutes, she grabbed the spare oilskin coat off the peg and stepped out into the storm. The rain was cold, but her breath came steady. Elijah turned when he heard her boots in the mud. She just held up the sack of nails and a hammer. "Tell me where," she said. He didn't argue. They worked in rhythm voices, low, not to spare words, but because they didn't need them. Every board held down was a conversation. Every shared glance a chapter in something neither of them could yet name. When the wind finally eased and the roof held steady, they stood together beneath the barn's overhang, dripping soaked through to the bone. Maribel's hair had fallen loose, plastered to her cheeks. Elijah reached out slowly, carefully, and brushed a strand behind her ear. Her breath caught, but he didn't press, just stepped back and said, "Let's get you warm." Back inside the house, he stoked the fire higher than usual. She handed him a dry towel and watched as he unbuttoned his soaked shirt, revealing a deep scar that ran from his shoulder to the center of his chest, an old wound ragged and faded, but still fierce in its story. He caught her gaze. "Got caught in a barn collapse 3 winters back. Snow came too fast. Wasn't anyone here to pull me out but me." "You healed yourself," he gave a half smile. "Not entirely. Took weeks to get right. But that's the thing about mending. Sometimes you have to hurt through it." She sat across from him near the hearth. The fire popped. The wind howled again through the eaves. "You talk more when it rains," she said gently. "Maybe I listen better when it storms." That night she didn't go to her room right away. Instead, they sat across from each other, a blanket draped over her shoulders, a tin cup of warm cider in his hand. The silence stretched again, but not empty. It felt like a space waiting to be filled. "I used to sing," Maribel said softly, "before I was ever married, before life got quiet." Elijah looked at her steady. "Then maybe it's time to unquiet it again." She laughed once, just a breath. "You think I still can? I think you already are." Her smile was slow, small, but real, the kind that belonged not to a new beginning, but to someone who had finally laid down the weight of pretending. When walls start to come down, what do two guarded hearts do with the open space between them? In the next chapter, a hand will reach and the other may not pull away. The wind that morning came in colder than it should have for early spring, sharp, honest, hard to ignore. Isaiah stood in the barn doorway, arms folded, watching Miriam saddle her horse. She moved with quiet certainty now. Her motions were confident, efficient, nothing like the hesitant girl who'd stepped off a train weeks ago with hope wrapped in modest cotton and borrowed courage. "You heading out to Northfield?" he asked. She nodded. "You said the fence line was giving trouble. Figured I'd see for myself." Isaiah hesitated. "You don't have to do it all alone, Miriam." She looked up, her voice firm. "And neither do you. But you keep trying. It wasn't meant to sting, but it did." He felt it under the ribs. Because it was true. Later that day, as the sun began to lower behind the hills, a wagon approached the homestead, a fine, polished one drawn by high-stepping horses. From it stepped Nathaniel Holt, Miriam's brother-in-law, the man who'd arranged her first marriage like trading horses at an auction. Miriam froze on the porch spine, straight hands clenched. Isaiah came to her side. Nathaniel took off his hat, but it didn't soften his voice. "You've caused quite the stir back home, Miriam. Running off, living with a man unmarried. It's a stain on your sister's name, on our family. I'm not your burden anymore," she replied. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. "Then be gone quietly. Sign this." He held out a document, an annulment of claim on any inheritance, a statement you left willingly. We'll say you went mad from grief. No scandal, no stories. Miriam didn't take the paper. Her eyes turned to Isaiah. "I don't need a name on paper to know who I am," she said. "And I don't need your protection anymore." Isaiah stepped forward, voice even. "You came here to shame her. But you forget this land doesn't listen to cowards. It listens to those who stay, build, bleed into it." Nathaniel sneered. "You think this arrangement gives her a future. She's nothing out here." Miriam smiled, not gently, not sweetly, but strong. "Then why does it scare you so much?" Nathaniel left. The dust from his wagon didn't linger long, but the echo of what had been said the stand Miriam took stayed like sunlight in cold air. That night Isaiah found her at the edge of the field, hands buried in the soil. "You didn't have to speak for me," she said, without looking at him. "I didn't," he replied. "I stood beside you." They stayed there in silence, because when a woman stops running and a man stops hiding, sometimes what's left is enough to rebuild everything. Have you ever had to stand tall, not with rage, but with quiet resolve, just to protect the small piece of peace you've finally found? In the final chapter, see how Miriam and Isaiah learn what it truly means to choose each other, even when the dust settles and the world still doubts. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the Montana air sharp with the smell of pine and promise. Elias stood outside the barn, reins in hand, saddling the horses with quiet precision. Beside him, Miriam adjusted her gloves, her eyes scanning the ridge beyond the pasture. No more hesitation, no more questions. Just this, the ride she'd asked for, the one that would either prove everything or prove nothing at all. They mounted, without fanfare, without words, two riders side by side. Not man leading woman, not rancher commanding wife, just equals riding the land that had once divided them. The trail wound upward, rough in places, quiet in others. No bird song, only the soft rhythm of hooves on packed dirt, the creak of leather, the breath of horses rising in clouds. At one point, Miriam stopped, looked back at the house below. "I used to think it'd never be mine," she said softly, "that it was just a roof over a debt." Elias followed her gaze, and now she turned her eyes toward him. "Now I know it's a home if the man inside it sees me as more than what I was sold for." He nodded slow. "I see you, Miriam. I see how you held your head when they laughed. I see how you stood between me and my silence." They rode again up the last slope. At the summit, the world stretched wide fields of gold below the ranch like a toy village in the distance, and the sky overhead quiet, aching blue. Miriam dismounted first, walked to the edge, wind tugging at her hair. Elias followed, boots crunching the frostbitten grass. "This ridge," he said, "my father used to stand here thinking it made him powerful." "And you?" she asked. "I think it makes me honest." She turned to him. "I used to believe being chosen meant being rescued," she whispered. "But it doesn't. It means being seen and still wanted." Elias didn't speak, just stepped forward, pulled a small slip of cloth from his pocket, unfolded it. Inside was a simple silver ring tarnished with age but strong. "This was my mother's," he said. "She wore it through droughts, through winters that near broke this land. When she passed, I told myself I'd never give it to someone unless I believed they could outlast the storms." He held it out, not as a command, not as apology, but as a promise. Miriam took it, slid it on herself. Her hands didn't tremble. "Let's ride home," she said, voice calm, resolute. "Together." They mounted again, side by side, turning back down the ridge toward the life they were no longer surviving, but choosing. Because in the West, some stories are carved in gunpowder and pride, but others like this one are stitched from quiet, from second chances, and from love that arrives not with thunder, but with steady steps beside you. From None, Wild West Saga, thank you for riding this journey with us. If Miriam's story stirred something in your heart, a memory, a hope, a promise, leave us a comment below. Would you like to see what happens next at the Archer Ranch, or hear another tale of resilience and quiet love under the wide western sky? Subscribe for more. Share this with someone who believes in second chances, and remember, sometimes the softest riders leave the deepest tracks,